Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Father Francesco Giordano, who's our Regional Director for Europe. Welcome to the podcast, Father.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you.
It's wonderful
It's
to
a
have
pleasure
you.
to be here. Thank you.
This is going to be a good conversation. And we're going to be talking today about spiritual warfare and the role that plays in the pro-life movement. And before we get started with the rest of the episode, I'm filming this, having just finished recording the episode. We did run into some technical difficulties, as you would expect when talking about spiritual warfare. So I apologize for the points where the screen will freeze up. The audio should continue as normal, but the screen definitely freezes up at different points. I hope you enjoy the episode. So, Father, actually, before we begin, could you just give a little bit of your credentials for our audience? They know why you can talk about this topic and that you actually know what you're talking about.
Well, I hope I know what I'm talking about. I mean, I teach theology and dogmatic theology, and that obviously incorporates things that elements of spiritual theology. I've directed work on that in spiritual theology, and I've also been involved with exorcism ministry in various forms throughout my priesthood. I'm now a priest for 15 years, and since the beginning of my priesthood, I've been involved with these kinds of issues. And so I also, do a lot of spiritual direction with different, different people of all walks of life. And so as a priest, I think we have to be, I think we have some credentials to be involved in spiritual warfare.
Definitely.
So, yeah.
No, I just thought it was good for our audience to know that you're a professor and you've also been involved with this, and you're not. I'm asking these questions to someone who knows what they're talking about. So let's just start with the basic question. What is spiritual warfare? Because I've heard that buzzword a lot, and I think it's helpful to kind of lay out what we're talking about right here at the beginning.
That's good. Yeah. And I was thinking in terms of the beginning, in fact, my reflection on this with Ephesians chapter 6, where St. Paul talks about the powers and principalities that we're fighting against. And it's interesting that it's in that chapter because Ephesians chapter 3 has to deal with the very depths of the divine, of God, of the heart of Jesus. It's used by the liturgy in that text. So Ephesians is actually quite a very rich letter in terms of all of this, the spiritual dimension. And I think that's the starting point to understand that we are in a spiritual war. And why can we say that? We can say that because as human beings we are not just animals. And so then what are we? Well, we're not angels. Angels are a little bit higher, are spiritual beings. Well, we're in between the animals and the angels. And what distinguishes us from the animals is our capacity to reason, our capacity, our faculties, our intellect, our will. The animals have passions. We also have passions, like they do. We have the irascible, the concupiscible passions. When we see some ice cream, we want to go after it, or we see something we don't like, we get angry. But dogs, for instance, they just do what their irascible and concupiscible passions want them to do. Children, young children, also they do that. And as soon as they're not happy, they let you know. And but the older you get, the more you work on your faculties and your intellect and your will, and you learn to control those instincts, what we call instincts.
Mm-hmm.
You don't just bark at someone when you don't like them. And well, that's the development of the reasoning of being able to live in society, of being able to function accordingly, And so that essentially is the spiritual dimension, is the linguistic dimension. There was this book by Michael Agros where he talks about the immortal in you, the soul. That's the key. This is the key. What kind of soul? A rational soul, not the animal soul, but the rational soul that can live for eternity, that can live even when we don't have this body left with us, that can be reunited to the body, yes, in the resurrection, the final days. But and that's where it links us to the angels. However, the angels have an intuitive intellect. We have a discursive intellect that becomes ever more intuitive, and they're able to understand things in the course of time. And this is why, in order to fight, because it is a fight, to regulate our concupiscible appetites and our irascible appetites and all that, we need to form the rational appetites, the will, with by means of the intellect, by means of an intellect that's informed by faith. That's the key. When Michael Agorist talks about the distinction between animals and people and us and human persons, specify human persons, not angelic persons, not divine persons, but human persons. He talks about the key difference is the language, because the language is what's able to understand the universals and is able to understand things that are principles above the concrete. Mm-hmm. And so he uses an example of going to the zoo and seeing a giraffe. The giraffe doesn't, it's not that the giraffe doesn't speaks a different language than you do. It's a completely different world. Giraffe, it's not that, when you see someone is, you see someone, a Chinese person, and you don't know Chinese and they don't know English, you know that you don't know the language, but you're both speaking a language. Both of your languages are able to understand certain universals the same way. They both have grammars. They both have a development of understanding life and the depths. So that's the spiritual dimension. Is our linguistic capacity is our spiritual dimension, and especially and the refinement of the language to be able to understand what is true from what is false. The adequatio intellectum ad rem. What is the definition of truth? Is the adequation of the intellect of what you understand here to what is reality. The problem is when language takes a course of its own, which is what we're seeing in the gender movement and all this. And we see, like, for instance, like, Simone de Beauvoir, she says, you're not born a woman, you become a woman. It's because she's a nominalist. She just focuses on language and thinks that language is what's able to define reality. But that's not the case. Language itself needs to be guided by the truth, by what is reality, and be able to define it, not dominate it. And so there you see already, I'm already getting into some touchy issues, because these are part of the spiritual warfare, is understanding and refining our intellect according to what is true, and refining our will to seek what is truly good for us.
I remember the last time you were on the podcast, which was when you were visiting Front Royal back in a couple of years ago. And you were saying that truth is making our intellect understand reality, and ideology is trying to conform reality to what we have in our mind. And I thought that was a really interesting distinction between the two. And so obviously we want to inform our intellects with what's true and real around us.
So. Yeah. And it's part of the spiritual warfare. I'm glad you remembered that.
It was a good point. So what is the role? Let's see, what's the next question that I want to ask? I guess let's start with, what is the role of spiritual warfare in, like, our everyday spiritual life? And then we can move from there into specifically the pro-life movement.
Okay. Well, in ordinary life, if you have to fight the powers and principalities, the first powers and principalities you're fighting, as I said, are your passions and stuff. And it's temptations, let's say. From a demonic point of view, from the angels and all that are tempting you, you got to fight that. You got to fight the ordinary temptations. Okay. And so you've got to be disciplined. For instance, the temptation of, like, you got to wake up at, I don't know, 6 o'clock in the morning, and you gotta get ready, and you fall for the temptation. You wake up at 6:30 instead. You want to sleep in a little bit more. Well, that's a lack of discipline, for instance. And you're like, okay, well, you fell for that temptation. And temptation is a key role, because temptation falls within the context of time. It falls within the context of just our lives, and developing the metanoia, the conversion to God, takes time. So temptation is normal. Like, let's say, you want to be, I don't know, a great runner that runs the marathon in, I don't know, a certain time. Well, it takes time for you to convert to become such a great marathon runner. And the marathon itself is a perfect example of this time that it takes to grow and to, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so you got to learn who you are. In fact, that St. Paul uses this as an example. It's a perfect example because life is like a marathon. You got to learn your limits, learn what's around you, know the context, fight with it, work with temptations, previous temptations. Maybe you did something wrong, but it's so tempting to go back to that because it's so much easier to do what was wrong because you were used to that. But now you know that you got to do this other thing. You can't eat that ice cream because if you do, it's going to cause you, I don't know, stomach ache or whatever. So you got to do. So you can't fall for those ordinary temptations. But the more you grow into what you want, the goal orientation. So you have a goal orientation, and this goes into Aristotle's causes. Before you do anything, you should know the final cause. What is it that you're trying to do? And the formal cause, who are you? And the material cause, what things do you have there to work with? The material and the efficient cause, the material cause work together. The formal cause, the final cause, you have to put all of them together to sort of make a plan of action and try to follow through with that. Being able to discern where the temptations can rise. And oftentimes it's not just you yourself that's doing it all on your own, but it's other people also, and that's where the ecclesial dimension comes into place here. It's not, salvation doesn't come alone, it comes with together. So that's part of the spiritual warfare and the discernment. And this is where, the exercises of St. Ignatius come in, the time that you have to fight with these things, and the silence and the recollection and the intense moments of change in your life, And it's like in a marathon, there's moments where you just need to stop and have a retreat, drink some water, think about it, reflect, strategize. That's what happens in any war. It's called a warfare, not a battle fair, because war is made up of many battles. And a marathon is many sprints, many moments of sprinting and not sprinting and stopping and doing this and strategizing and having objectives and all this. It's really very edifying to be able to see life like that, to see that there is a goal and other people are involved and what you do matters to others and what they do matters to you and to see a larger picture, to give meaning to yourself, to life, in general. So I think the first step is this learning how to be goal oriented and learn where the temptations lie, where your weaknesses are, where your strengths are, and work with that.
So to clarify for our audience then, spiritual warfare isn't simply a series of prayers to combat the temptations of the devil or anything like that. It's actually like working on yourself and bringing your passions and your appetite under the control of reason. Is that kind of a correct summary of this?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's very well defined. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it's a little easy to hear the spiritual warfare and think like it's, up here, not actually involving my personal temptations that I'm dealing with. So I just wanted to kind of tease that out for our audience. So what is the role of spiritual warfare in the pro-life movement? And why don't you talk a little bit about that? And then I'm going to read an email that we received last year that definitely talks about the demonic ties of abortion, which I want our audience to hear. But let's just start with what's the role of spiritual warfare in the pro-life movement?
Okay. As we know, spiritual warfare requires us to use the instruments of grace, which are the sacraments. Contact with Christ is fundamental to constantly be attached to our Lord, the Eucharist, the Mass, and all that. So that's fundamental to spiritual warfare in general. What we're dealing with in the pro-life movement is we're dealing with another sacrament, a demonic sacrament. We're dealing with abortion, which is it's a demonic sacrament. The devil hates people. The devil does not want people to be. I always stress this, like the devil is so envious that he doesn't let the possibles come into existence. So I wrote an article recently on contraception, and I said contraception is exactly this. It's an impediment on letting what God wants to be to be. So it's the devil. It's the devil's. So all of this all of this, from contraception to abortion, because they're connected, as we know, intimately connected. It's a lie for us to think that, the more contraceptives you have, the fewer abortions you're going to have. It's a complete lie, because the numbers speak for themselves. As soon as the pill came into the market, abortion skyrocketed. It's the contraceptive mentality. It's a spiritual mentality, and their sacrament is abortion.
Mhm.
It's like the spiritual mentality of contraception, then becomes itself an a sacrament of abortion. And you think about this, the sacraments also are tied to specific feast days. So when you have the feast of the Sacred Heart, or the feast of Corpus Domini, the strength of that feast is even more spiritual. It's like this. The church works ex opere operantis. So the church has, the holier the church is, the stronger the church is.
Mhm.
And the sacraments are ex opere operato. They work in and of themselves. If they don't work for us, it's because we're not corresponding appropriately, but that's what they are. And so, like, for example, there's the Feast of Corpus Domini. In that moment, it's a good thing it would be a good idea to take the Eucharist more into consideration, to have more Eucharistic adoration or whatever. Feast of Our Lady of Sorrows, to reflect more on how Our Lady felt with the Passion. Last week, Sister Agnes from Akita died, and she died on what day? On the 15th, on the Feast of the Assumption. She was close to Our Lady, and Our Lady took her on that day. So the days are important. Feast days are important. Okay, so because there's these parallel universes, if that's what works for the church, spiritually and sacramentally and all, what works for the other side, because that's what it is, it's another church. Well, I mean, Halloween. Halloween, you've got, for instance, you got All Saints, but right before having All Saints, you have Halloween. Well, and you're thinking, oh, that's just a childish feast. That's not how the other church looks at it. And they will use those particular days, to do heinous things.
Mhm.
And among them, there will be an increase in abortion on Halloween across the world. We look at some statistics, and they'll have an increase in abortions on that specific day. And that's just an example. I mean, we have to remember, they're using this as a sacrament. And what does the sacraments do? Well, it gives them a certain power. And so but remember that the power that they get, this is really important to understand this. Whenever you make a contract with the devil, I'm sorry, now I'm going into the demonic here, because we're dealing with that. Whenever you make a contract with the devil, it's not that the devil can really hold on to that contract. He can only hold on to whatever God permits him to hold on to. He doesn't have all this power. He only has the power that God lets him have. So, like John Lennon, for instance, he consecrated himself because he wanted fame. So he consecrates himself to the devil. And the devil said, I'll give you 20 years of fame. 20 years to the letter, he was killed. Like that week, 20 years to the letter. So the devil there was permitted by God to give him what he wanted. So what you've got to understand this. There's this sacramental dimension. There's this contractual dimension. That's what a sacrament is. It's a contract. You have a contract that is signed by what? The blood of Christ. And he does not back away from his contract ever. He's God. He decides. The devil cannot, but God does. And what they do is they imitate. The devils imitate. Scimmiotare, we say in Italian, like the monkeys. They imitate, but they are not what God is. Of course, only God is God. But they will imitate and try to do. So they try to imitate the church and create a parallel church, a parallel structure. to the church, and so they have their own sacraments, their own priests and priestesses, and priestesses too. They don't have just priests; they have witches and warlocks. They call, and we laugh about this. Sometimes you kind of laugh about these things. You have like these shows from the 1960s, Bewitched or whatever, and people laugh about it. But they're serious. These things are serious. There is this underworld going on.
Yeah. That's interesting about so the correlation of abortions going up on Halloween. You said it happens across the world, which is interesting because I think of Halloween more as an American sort of something that Americans have latched onto. So I didn't realize that was something that happened all around the world. And is that a correlation or causation? Is it more that the people participating in these things have latched onto Halloween as like their quote unquote feast day, and that's why there's more abortions? Or is there something inherent in All Hallows Eve that the demonic upholds?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily a causation. It's a good question. All I'm seeing is that Halloween itself is making inroads in other countries. For example, in Italy, 30 years ago, there's no such thing as Halloween.
Okay.
And now it's like the in thing for young people since 15 years. About 15 years it's been going on now here. And it's been forced. It's been really really propagated. And then, but they laugh about it, but it's like but obviously there's different levels. There's those that are just innocent, they don't know what they're doing. But those that do know behind the scenes, they're doing things on those days. There's definitely a relationship, or else the numbers would not be going up on that day. And there's definitely a desire from certain people to propagate this ridiculous feast.
Yeah, I guess that was kind of a little bit of my question of because All Hallows Eve obviously was originally just the eve of a great feast day. So it's not
exactly
the original celebration wasn't a demonic celebration, but it does seem like that the forces of evil have kind of latched onto it to make it their own.
That's right. No, I can see that. Yeah.
I also just didn't want to freak out any of our audience who have kids that like going trick-or-treating or anything like that. So
well, I mean, if you study the roots of it, the trick or treats, and you look at, it's not very good generally. I mean, I have to agree that when I was a kid doing it, I didn't realize it, and that's what you're probably saying, the innocent children or whatever that are not really aware of this. So I would encourage very much parents to celebrate the All Saints and having their children dress up as saints. There is this tradition in the church, and I would encourage all pastors to encourage that, to emphasize that, because we teach by these kinds of things. We teach by what we emphasize. Yeah. So not necessarily to have a huge all out war against Halloween. I think it would be a lost war right now because it's very culturally embedded and people don't understand. But to add, to add to that, drown them out with what is good.
Okay, so I want to read for our audience an email that we received last November. And this is something I've been sitting on for about a year because I didn't want to do a sensationalist episode on demonic activity. I didn't want to use people's suffering as clickbait. But I did feel like it was important to read and so people know. So this is an email from someone who's affiliated with HLI, who lives in America, about things that were happening in America last Halloween. So we received it in early November. And I'm just going to read the text because she says it much better than I ever could. Last week was a very strong week in terms of rescues and work to avoid abortions. There were many calls, especially on October 31st. I was driving to the office in the morning, and Maria, I changed the names to protect everyone's safety. So Maria, a girl that I had rescued in the past 9 months, called, needing help with an ultrasound. I took Maria to get the ultrasound. On the way, she told me her plan. She would be paid $3,500 for her to sell her baby that night in a satanic cult. She wanted to see how her baby was doing in the ultrasound. When we did the ultrasound, we saw that her baby was not able to be born yet. She was 36 weeks, almost to be completed in 2 days. We explained all the inconveniences, the risks, even of her life, but we could not get her to accept. She got the offer to sell the baby from quote unquote great friends, she said, an offer she had to accept. And then later in the day, they received calls from two other girls at 40 weeks and 39 weeks that had the same situation as Maria. The one that has 40 weeks was searching for an ultrasound to see the baby for the last time. She had an offer of $4,000. She was also raped 40 weeks before so that she would have her baby on Halloween. She was very, very, very afraid. She knew the risks and all the situation, but she was decided. The other girl was 39 weeks, but she did not give us much info. I called the three of them to a room. I told them that for $3,500 or $4,000, they could pay any debt for a month or maybe 2 months, but it was the life of their babies, the regret that they will last forever. The regret that they will have will last forever. I explained also that it was very easy to find that money. We could get a loan, or I could get donations, or even talk to them about adoption to avoid the madness they were going to commit. As I noticed them so determined, I asked them, "And you? Maybe you won't live tomorrow. Did they tell you what they were going to do to you?" The three of them didn't know. So I pulled up a YouTube video of a satanic rite where they sacrificed the baby and the mother died. Unfortunately, I felt the need to do this. The girls watched it. In the end, I know that two of the girls didn't do the abortion. They were very scared. I pray the third one didn't, but I don't know for sure. So that was the email, and that is quite a story. How common is this?
I think it's much more common than we think. I think it must be much more common than we think. I'm not sure how common it is, but I do know that I know that there are rituals going on those days. Those are their feast days, and I know that abortion is their sacrament. It's basically confirming what I'm telling you, what I do know in what we're fighting here. So, and I wouldn't be surprised how common if it's very very common. I mean, I think we need to open up our eyes and see, the hostility that we're seeing in general against Catholicism. Catholicism. I mean, it's just I have some news. I get news footage every day, lots sorts of things happening, and I have one of these sites that I get is news footage of what's happening across the world, the Catholic world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all sorts of things, but it's amazing what I'm seeing in terms of like people burning churches in Canada, in France. I mean, think about Notre Dame Cathedral in 2019, for crying out loud, And they say they're accidents, but how many accidents can you really be having? I mean, um, I don't think they're accidents. I think behind the scenes, there's lots of things going on. There's just lots of wars going on right now, and cultural wars of all sorts. And I mean, it's just we have to wake up, and we are waking up. I think. I mean, the politics, what's going on in politics. I mean, the. I mean, I don't need to get into that here, but it's just amazing the things that people could do for certain objectives. So, if someone really believes in this and is really, dedicated to the devil, of course they're gonna do these kinds of things, and of course it's gonna happen more often. And you're gonna find victims very easily. I think we live in a world also with very fragile people. People today are very wounded and fragile, and um, I was just watching. I was reading an article. I think I don't know which movie star, uh, uh, Goldie Hawn. I think yeah, it was Goldie Hawn, and she was talking about not getting married to her, uh, to the other star. I forgot his name right now, because they don't want something stable. They're afraid of the stability. I mean, she just basically voiced what people are, and so people are unstable today. The second of marriage is being attacked. If you think about this, I mean, what this is overall, it's a cultural thing. It's epical. It's all been discussed, all been announced by Our Lady and Quito, for example. Our Lady of Quito. I have some notes here. I put some notes down where she said, that basically would be that there would be an epoch when passions would be abounding,
Mhm.
where, Alistair McIntyre talks about emotivism in his book After Virtue, 1981. 1981. Also, you read, like, another book that I often use is The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, 1987. If you read that, it's like reading what's going on today. But McIntyre, when he talks about emotivism, we are living in an emotional society, a superficial society, because that's where the devil works. Actually, the devil works on the emotions and the imagination. That's exactly where it works. And people in their spiritual life, they think that um, that they follow too much their emotions. By the way, and the problem with following your emotions and not following your reasoning is that the other beings can tap into those emotions. And
Mm.
we know that the demons and the demons, they're evil angels and the good angels, they work on that. They can work on that.
Mhm.
They cannot work deeper than that, because deeper than that is the soul, and the contact, and the soul is where you have the freedom to be in touch with. It's your property, the soul. And you have a right to keep that property. It's your property, God-given property. And only God can talk to you in your soul. And then, well, how do you reach God? Well, you have to learn how to listen and discern and not be guided by your passions. Um, Our Lady also talks about the masonry. She talks about the masonry that governs the
Mhm.
occult, the hidden societies. Occult. That's what the occult is. It's the hidden. You don't know them. You don't see them. You only see their fruits. The people, those behind the scenes. Who is it? These hidden things. Our Lady talks about this in the 17th century. Then she also talks about another thing that's going in the 17th century, in 1608. She talks about children. She talks about the children being corrupted. Well, what are we seeing today? And then the state wanting to take the children from the parents and educating. The state needs to educate them. No, where the parents come in. The struggles today that good families are going through, uh, struggling to raise their children in this society and in this time, to educate their children. Well, with all these influences, 2008, the so-called smartphone comes out. It's not smart, really. All of this creates the society that we're living in. It's a society that is running on a different course, and there's she also talks about Our Lady also talks about the attack, the sacrileges of the Eucharist. She also talks about the lack of extreme unction. In fact, there's a lot of
Mhm.
people today that don't call the priest before the dying. She talks about essentially the ascent of Satan in the highest realms. Um, she talks about the sacrament of matrimony, and you look at this and you're like, well, there's so many marriages today that are broken, and there are exorcisms that deal with this. That certain souls, they'll be like, there was an exorcism of this woman, of this religious, that she was possessed because God permitted her to be possessed for the sins of her city. The exorcist found out that it was because of the sins of a particular sin in the city, and that sin was the sin of divorce. So she had to atone for that. That's why she was suffering all of this. So all of these things that we're doing, all of these major sins too, the major, just major sins today, um, especially in the realm of sexual sins, the lust and all that,
Mhm.
all of that's going to have consequences, spiritual consequences. It's not something that's just there and it's not going to have any effect. It's going to have an effect. And in fact, what we're seeing is we're seeing that uh, that the world is becoming very similar to hell in many ways. It's becoming, it's more similar to hell because there isn't love. People don't love each other as much. Um, they're selfish, or they're not thinking about it. There's no sense of sacrifice.
Mhm.
That's all going out, and this has all been forewarned.
Mhm.
And Quito, it's been forewarned at Fatima, it's been forewarned at Akita, it's been forewarned. We've been told about this time that we're living, and we're living in it. No,
Mhm.
what's the message? So your question, how can we be surprised? How can this be happening that there's a book? Of course there are. Of course, I'm not surprised that people are that people are involved in this abortion. The highest levels are doing this willfully, intentionally, with they're
Mhm.
doing it for a specific reason. It's a sacramental system. They have specific days when they do this more than others. Of course they do. They know more about the sacraments than we do, oftentimes, the Satanists. And the ones that we see on TV are the ones that make themselves public. They're not the real, that's not the real deal. The real deal are those that are much more hidden, occult,
Mhm.
hidden.
And there
That's the
is,
thing that's going.
oh, well, somebody was making the point too that they even use the language. Like instead of this is my body given up for you, they say my body, my choice. It's like a twisting of the words of the
That's
Constitution.
absolutely right. Yeah, it's a sacramental system. I just wrote an article the other day uh, on religion and remembrance. It was a comment on this book by Bishop Eric Varden. Um, it was called "The Shattering of Loneliness." Beautiful book. And he talks about remembrance, Christian remembrance, remembering. And if you think about it, that's the key: is remembering things. Remembering God, and that's the way you're going to fight, is by remembering God. You're going to remember, and the desires, the longing that you have comes from God. It doesn't come from your desires. He distinguishes between desires
Mhm.
and longing. And desire is a very natural level. Longing comes from the outside. It's higher. It elevates you beyond. And real living out your religion fully also makes you uh, makes you strong.
Mhm.
And in fact, he uses this example of the wife of Lot. She turns around because Lot is mediocre in his faith. He's not
Mhm.
strong enough. He's not, and so she doesn't know what to believe. So she turns back and she becomes salt. So it's the importance of being even more religious. The point is, like, so we see the society the way it is, and this should not make us feel like, oh gosh, fearful. No, we should be aware that in this time we have to be more religious than ever before, and that we have to be aware that our actions in this time earn more merit than they did before, because it's harder to be good today. It's harder to be fighting the good fight today, because you get laughed at, because you get ostracized, because this, because that, you fill in the blank, and we all know what it means. The persecution, the subtle persecution for being a Catholic today, working in the workforce, for instance, the subtle persecution of women that are trying to be good mothers, and they're working, and not easy to be a good mother working today, a good working mother. For instance, it's quite a fight. Um, and that's why I recommend books that think about these kinds of things. Like, I just did another article. The article I wrote on contraception dealt with the book by Abigail Favell.
Mhm.
It's a book. It's called The Genesis of Gender. The fourth chapter of this book, on the genesis of gender, she talks about contraception. I highly recommend this book, by the way, because I think it's very intelligently written. She's a feminist. She comes out, and the first book chapter is on waves, the different waves of feminism. But she's become Catholic, and she realizes that Margaret Sanger, Simone de Beauvoir, all these people. There was things that were flawed in their arguments, especially um, what's her name, the famous Judith Butler. She adored this Judith Butler and all these people that are really behind the movement. But she realized there were flaws in their arguments, and she realized there was something that was just not there. Talking about desires and longing, And I just find that people like this, that they know what it's about, and they know where they want, and they're sincere, they're honest. That's the people we need to be reading. I think that's why I cannot help but encourage you to read that book because because it gives you it opens your perspective on things, and that's what we really need, and we really need depth. We really need depth today. We cannot play with sound bites anymore. This is not. We can't be just political sound bites. I'm listening to these days. I'm listening to the different political debates going on. It's fascinating. I'm enjoying it. Commentaries and all this. But I do find that in the speeches, even if I agree with the speeches completely, that the definitions are not always so clear. They're not always deep. But obviously, because they're trying to, there's a form of propaganda. They're trying to reach, the largest number of people. They're just trying to get a grasp, which is okay, fine. But if we do not cast that into the deep, we're not going to solve anything. And the spiritual warfare is about the spiritual life, and individually and ecclesially, and casting out into the depths of God, Ephesians chapter 3, the depths of the Sacred Heart. And a devotion means that it's tied to the will, but the will is a rational appetite. And you have to feed the will. You have to feed the will. So for me, it's not I am not satisfied as a professor, just the way that I am. I've never been satisfied with sound bites. I remember when I went on a pro-life march, one of the first pro-life marches I went to, someone was like, "Yeah, we get to fight for life because it's life." Okay. I mean, I agree with her. I agree. We need to fight for life because it's life. We need to go to pro-life marches. We need to do all of that. I agree. But there's that something in me, and I think it's in all of us, that longs for depth. That longs for depth. It's called the conscience, I think. And I think that if we don't feed that, we're wronging ourselves. And we're not going to be able to win anything, especially at war. The war is to be fought with strategy. And strategy requires thought. It requires nourishing thought. And not falling for the first soundbite that comes your way, even if you agree with it. Always question it, but not question for the sake of question, but question for the sake of going into and understanding it. Because the more rooted you are in the truth, in what is true and what is really the stronger you are. And the gospel says this. We want to root ourselves in. I mean, you have to know how to do your construction. You don't just start putting a wall up without any foundation. Can you? Fine, I'm just going to put up a wall. Fine, yeah. And the first storm that comes your way comes tumbling down. It's so basic. But why can we understand this for construction physically? But why can't we understand this for construction spiritually? And that's the point I'm trying to make here. And that's why I like these books are important. And today I think that what they're trying to do is they're trying to make us not study, not read, but the time that you dedicate to a good reading, a good nourishment of the soul like that, a good time in front of the Blessed Sacraments, reading even before the Blessed Sacraments. Saint Teresa of Avila, she was a warrior herself. She would bring a book. You're not dealing with emotions. You're dealing with strategies. You're dealing with life. You're dealing with the deepest issues that you can possibly face, human issues, your own personal life, and those of society at large. When you're about to get married to someone, for crying out loud, also, when you're making a decision about getting married, what reasons do you have for getting married? Do you understand what you're getting into? Things like that. Do people stop and think, let me discern this, let me talk to Jesus about this, let me go into church and pray about this, let me really think about this, let me read some books, read some examples that other people have to share with me.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And it actually leads into I have two last questions for you, which are kind of connected. First one is, what practical things can listeners do to enrich their spiritual life, help with spiritual warfare? Because I'm a huge fan of having a practical application to the things that we talk about in podcasts. And I don't want to do spiritual warfare, it'll get clicks, and then not actually have any helpful content for listeners. And second, there's parts of this episode that have been very dark. And what hope is there for our listeners to walk away with?
Well, first thing, I mean, to answer the first question, I think we have to realize that we're in a marathon, and you're in a marathon, so you have to strategize, you have to think, you have to look at, you have to know, you have to have a map of your life, of things that you're doing, and start having a plan of life. It's important to have a plan of life. It's important to be concrete about your spiritual life. So go to a spiritual director and help get some guidance in terms of steps. I talk to someone that knows more, that's more experienced in the spiritual life, and have that person guide you through. And journal, I don't know, get some sort of a schedule or something on paper. This is what I'm going to dedicate to this, and this, etc. Have some points, there's a there's a value to that. There's a practical value to that, but it's also more than practical. I think it also affects you because, if you serve order, order will if you serve order, order will serve you. That way, it's like so. And Introduction to the Devout Life by St. Francis de Sales, for example, is a really good book to go to for this sort of like, begin thinking about, this, how to live this. Or Sertillange's book, The Intellectual Life, or whatever. There's lots of books out there. There's lots of helpful books that help us discern, how to do things. The Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius. There's lots of groups out there. There's lots of initiatives out there. Join them. Be a part of them. It's always good to do things also with other people, because then you have accountability. I think that's important in the spiritual life, and that's why this becomes like a movement of sorts. It's important to be accountable to someone else. That's why you see, like, the monastic life begins with, hermits. They are hermits, but then they're cenobites, and then they become monks, because hermits are like, they kind of do things on their own with God. But then, it's good to, so you have St. Simon Stylites on his pole up there, and everyone goes up to him to get wisdom from him because he's up there with God, Okay, but sometimes, you got some hermits they're living like hermits together, and they meet every once in a while. That's a cenobitic life. So there's got to be some of this. It's part of our human nature that you've got to get together with other people who are like-minded. So it's very important to have friendships. We have to remember that we are made to do the will of God and to be pleasing to God. To do his will is to be pleasing to him, to become saints. But you don't do that you don't just do that as an idea. You do that very practically. You do that with holy friendships. And how do you know that they are good friendships? Because they're following the same objective you're following. So usually you'll find these people in common areas, like parish or whatever. I don't know, you online. I don't know. There's certain groups of people that want to, there's people that want to do something common, like someone in common. I want to be a saint. Can you have the online group of people want to become saints? I don't know. It's very broad as a topic, but find people with common interests and common objectives, and that can work with you. That's very important. So, because in the end, it's all about friendship. It's friendship with God. and in friendship with those that are friends of God. Because friends of friends, you'll notice in the history of the saints that all the saints are friends with each other. Usually, they help each other out. So it's never anything. It's never anything that you can do on your own. That's really important. The ecclesial dimension to this. Then you ask for the last thing. I think you said something about hope, but I think this sets up the hope because we're not alone. It's not. Don't fall for the temptation of being completely alone. No, and we're fighting for someone that is more powerful than any other powers and principality. John 15:5, I think it is. Without me, you can do nothing. We have Jesus on our side. The end of the gospel, the end of the prologue to Gospel of St. John also. Gospel of St. John is fantastic, but the end of the prologue, he says there's all these people that didn't accept Jesus, but those who did, he made them powerful, he made them strong. So we are strong in him. So our hope is our hope is him. Our hope is our faith in him and living according to that faith, and just taking the life of our life of faith seriously, and so seriously that we want to be accountable for it. We want to be with others that are like-minded, and that can help us out when we're having a little bit of a difficulty. That can be our Saint Simeon, who helps us carry our cross, for instance. Our Lord teaches us so much in the gospel, and yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Father. This has been a wonderful episode, despite all the technological issues. Thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And to all of our listeners, I hope this was helpful. Check out the new ebooks that we have coming out and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.